Thank you, everybody. Yeah, it is my pleasure to be able to introduce Zach Gage and Drew Murray, two excellent game designers who I'm really excited to hear what they're talking about. I only have the little paragraph length synopsis, and they both sound quite intriguing. So I think we're going to start with Zach, if that's okay. I imagine most people here know Zach, but just to give a brief CV, Zach is a game designer who is probably best known for Spell Tower. He was one of the people who worked on the iOS version of Ridiculous Fishing. He made a board game called Guts of Glory, and he has made lots of other interesting experimental games, including Lose Lose, one of those games that we've all heard about but are all too scared to play. Anything else I should? And he's a good guy. I've known him for a while. First, I do want to tell one brief anecdote. The time I met Zach was at a Baby Castles conference where he gave a talk about Stuxnet to what turned out to be an audience of 6-year-olds and their parents. And it went over pretty well. I think they got most of it, and I was like, I got to meet that guy. That guy's interesting. And now you all meet him. It is my pleasure to introduce Zach Gage.
Whoa. All right. Let's do this. Okay, so just before I start, ever since I met Andy Nealon, I've started my talks with this caveat that I'm not an academic and I'm not a researcher, I'm an artist. All of my conclusions are rooted in anecdote and theory. This is especially important in this talk because in this talk I'm actually going to be referencing real research, so this is going to be very complicated for you guys to parse out. Okay. So, you guys know when you're playtesting a game, and it's also, I'm crunching this in, so I might give this a little fast. So you know when you're playtesting a game and it's like going really, really, really badly. Like you're watching a tester play your game, and they're trying the same thing over and over and over again, and you're just, oh my God, please, come on. And then they just are just like, I'm sorry, and they give it back to you. Like that sucks, right? I think we've probably all had that experience. Also, maybe some of us are lucky enough to have like the opposite experience when you are playtesting a game with somebody and they like something clicks and they like get it and they get your game and they do something really interesting that you didn't think of and you're like, yes, I did it. That's the best, right? And hopefully that's happened. So in these situations, what you're witnessing, I believe, is the frustration of a novice problem solver and the power of an expert problem solver. And it turns out, I didn't know this, there's an entire field of research on this. So apologies for how dry this is, but before I can talk about the research, I have to teach you what the research says, which I'm not used to doing. So problem-solving research is an area in which it was all about finding superior educational methodologies, and they did this a lot in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and they wanted to discover basically the underpinnings of problem-solving and learn how to teach problem-solving, which makes sense if you think about it, because one way to think about problem solvers is that good problem solvers are really strong self-learners. And so it's kind of like a magic bullet for education. If you can just turn everyone into great problem solvers, they'll all teach themselves. The main distinction between strong problem solvers and weak problem solvers is their ability to solve what are called non-routine problems. And this is going to be really important terminology for this talk, so I want to make sure that I get it right. So basically, routine problems are problems that learners know how to solve based on past experience. So for example, like finding the product of 567 and 46 is a routine problem for most adults because they know how to do it and they can act out the steps. It's important to note that routine doesn't mean easy. This isn't an easy problem, but we all know how to do it. So to contrast, non-routine problems are problems which learners don't immediately know a usable solution method. So for example, like a cycle shop has a total of 36 bicycles and tricycles. You didn't know there would be a test. In stock, collectively there are 80 wheels. How many bikes and trikes are there, right? So like that's a complicated problem. One solution would be to say like, okay, well, all 36 have to have at least 2 wheels, and 36 times 2 is 72, and there must be 80 wheels in total. So the 8 additional wheels need to be tricycles, so 36 minus 8 is 28, so there are 28 bikes and 8 trikes, right? Another approach, I'm sure you are all ahead of me on that. Another approach would be to like guess and check, or you could like put together an algebraic representation. But the key here is that an expert problem solver could actually look at this problem and come up with a bunch of those different approaches, and then they could sort of flexibly choose between which one was the most appropriate and easy for them to solve the problem. So the trick then is like, how do they do that? Well, so one thing we know is that the difference between an expert problem solver and a novice problem solver is their ability to form a mental model of the problem's essential components. So researchers looked at this and they sort of one way to think about this is with this problem, right? So at Arco, gas sells for $1.13 a gallon. This is 5 more cents per gallon than gas at Chevron. How much is 5 gallons of gas at Chevron? So when researchers gave this problem to people, what they found is that what commonly happened with poor problem solvers is that they would look at superficial solutions and try to find keywords that would cue common arithmetic operations. So for example, like $1.13 and 5 cents followed by the keyword less suggests to students that they should subtract 5 cents from 113 to get to 108. And then the keywords how much and 5 gallons would suggest that 5 should be multiplied by the result, which would yield $5.40, which is obviously wrong because they messed up in the first part. So by contrast, a more proficient approach with good students who could solve the problem properly tended to be that they would form a mental model of this. And they know that because they studied students' eye fixations when they worked on this problem, and they found that students who were good at problem solving tended to focus on terms like Arco, Chevron, and this, which are terms that help you building a mental model of something, as opposed to those numbers and keywords, which if you're trying to apply a superficial solution are better. So what's happening here is that poor problem solvers are looking at surface level features of problems, and expert problem solvers are looking at the deeper structural relationships that are within the problems and finding the clues for how to solve the problems there. And this is literally what's happening inside the brain of the person who tries the same strategy over and over again on your game. They are looking at superficial keywords essentially in your game, and they're applying a basic methodology, and when it doesn't work out because they got the relationships wrong, they're assuming that they applied the methodology incorrectly and not that they used the wrong methodology. And so they apply it over and over again, and it keeps not working, and they spin their wheels, and they hand the controller back to you. So as game designers, when we think about how we would solve this problem of like a frustrated or stuck user, it's pretty unlikely that we'd be like, well, they just suck at problem solving, so screw them, right? Probably what we'd actually do is we would build a tutorial that slowly takes every problem that was a non-routine problem to these people and slowly turns it into a routine problem by giving them semi-routine problems in a stepwise nature along the way. And what's interesting to me about this isn't really an attempt to improve their problem solving skills. What it is a way to step around their problem solving skills and say like, okay, you're not great at problem solving, maybe you're kind of good at problem solving. Maybe we can teach you how to do this even though you're only kind of good at problem solving. So where does this come from? So it probably comes from this other theory of education that I want to talk about today, and that's constructivist theory. And this is a little shorter. Constructivist theory is basically the belief that learners learn by doing as opposed to being told things. And so one common way to teach constructivistly would be to, instead of telling a student how a task works, giving them a series of semi-routine problems to solve that they teach themselves how the task works. So in this way, learners are still kind of solving these problems themselves, but they're doing so in a fairly linearly guided way that doesn't have any reliance on them being expert problem solvers. So for example, a constructivist way to teach multiplication to somebody who can count, and this is how a lot of you may have learned to count if you're around my age, is with skip counting. So skip counting is like, if you want to skip count by 2, for example, you sit in a circle with all your friends and you count out loud, and the people who are not on the 2s are quiet. So you'd be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that's how you start to learn by 2s. It's basically counting, but it's this new thing. And then when you start to get to multiplying by 2s, what you start to notice is like, oh, well, actually, it's pretty similar to skip counting. So here you can say we sort of took this big problem and we broke it down into these little steps and turned it into semi-routine problems. And this does a really good job of balancing focused direction with self-learning, I think, and that's why a lot of teaching works like this. And it's basically this sort of step style of learning, and where every new lesson is based off of an old lesson that we've already taught you. And when you look at this, you realize that this is really basically how we design tutorials and games the majority of the time, right? So this is where this finally kind of gets interesting to me, is where like when we take these theories of education and these different ways of looking at things and we look at games through them and we look at difficulty through them, we have this new language that we can talk about difficulty through. So like in some games, let's see. So when we talk about difficulty of games, we're often referring to the difficulty of like a particular problem in a game. So like easy algebra versus hard algebra, there's a difficulty. And then when we talk about like the difficulty of a game as a whole, what we're often talking about is like that space between the steps of the problems, like how steep our staircase is, talks about how hard the game is as a whole. But that's not the only way to talk about difficulty, because that method of talking about difficulty never really talks about how hard it is to understand something that's like entirely new, that you don't understand at all, that's like way out of your range. So there's this other kind of difficulty, and it's this accessibility difficulty, and it looks a little bit different. It's sort of the accessibility of non-routine problems, which is hard, versus routine problems, which are easy. And really, I think this is actually a much better set of words for understanding difficulty, because difficulty really has a lot more to do with routineness than it has to do with the stepwise increase. Because, like, for example, solving one multiplication problem is not really easier or harder than solving 10, but it is easier than solving an algebra problem until you understand algebra, and then solving a multiplication problem and an algebra problem are basically the same. So like complexity is basically only this hard thing when it's foreign. Once it becomes not foreign, it turns into work and not difficulty. Often when I hear difficulty explained, it's sort of this muddled mixture of like work quantity and non-routineness, and then, or like maybe looking at it as like a performative measure, like how fast can you solve 10 multiplication problems. But even there, speed is initially kind of a function of how routine the problem is, because problem solving is relevant up into a point, but then like once you've really gotten the hang of doing something, and this is really interesting to me because like I feel like we use speed a lot in our games, and what's interesting about speed is like when you first start trying to do speed, how routine or non-routine something is really impacts the difficulty. But once you've got like a superficial method for it, then speed turns into how fast can you apply this superficial method over and over again, which makes sense when we think about how our games are not often about actually teaching people to solve non-routine problems. Instead, we built a bunch of challenges around routine problems that are much easier for people to approach. I think there are a myriad of reasons why we often don't think about this kind of accessibility problem. A lot of the time, it can be because we're not actually creating wildly new types of games, and so we don't have to. For example, like every Bejeweled alike is effectively a routine problem for every other Bejeweled alike. Anyone who's played one, they can use the same strategies, the same pattern matching to solve all of them. They don't have to be a good problem solver to approach a game like this once they already understand how to approach a game like this. They can just use superficial techniques. And so I think another place where this is sort of useful is when we think about like hardcore and casual games in this way. Through the step difficulty mindset, we might be tempted to, wow, I really need to speed up, to classify hardcore games as hard because the problems are usually steeper, longer flights of steps, and we might be tempted to classify casual games as easy because they have smoother, shorter flights, except for Candy Crush Saga, which is long and horrible. But interestingly, if we think of these two categories through the lens of problem-solving theory, we find that it's really only the most ardent gamers who are actually approaching non-routine problems. So like people who play like Spelunky or Dark Souls or Dwarf Fortress or Sunday Crosswords. These are the games that are like really, truly non-routine. For everybody else, you have like Plants vs. Zombies 2 and FIFA 14 and Call of Duty 13 and Angry Birds 5 and Assassin's Creed 21 if you count all the spin-offs. So really, both of these categories are kind of easy through this lens. There's like, it's a different breakdown. And I think given that, it's kind of important to not think about difficulty universally as a quality of hardcore games and easy difficulty not being universally a quality of casual games. I think anecdotally, most people enjoy non-routine or semi-routine challenges as long as they find them accessible, and that really the major difference between most casual and hardcore gamers is the set of problems that they actually have the superficial skills to solve. So weirdly, I find that we actually don't talk about this accessibility stuff when we're building tutorials for our games. So often we ignore whether or not the player is a good or a bad problem solver, and instead we assume the position of teaching the player our game through these kind of constructivist stepwise tutorials. But games aren't math, they're not a universally standardized framework, and they're not taught to players by living people who can adjust their lessons to a particular learner's ability. So because of this kind of misalignment, we're forced to design all these weird things in our tutorials. We have to design our tutorials to the lowest reasonable skill set, but then we worry about them being boring, so we have to have clever hidden goals and secrets to keep experts from nodding off while we get into the game. So a really good example of this is like Super Meat Boy, whose worlds are filled with secrets and time records to keep pros busy while they actually do a very modest step tutorial to get somebody new into the game smoothly. But even with that, Super Meat Boy really still isn't a game made for everyone, which is fine. But we have to sort of admit that it's a game made for hardcore platform gamers. It's a game with a targeted audience that the people who were building the tutorial could assume a set of information, they knew where they were starting from, and they could assume a general ability to grapple with big steps because they were making a hardcore game. So the lesson here is if you are going to build a stepwise tutorial in this way, you should actually revel in the fact that you can target an audience and not try to like do this thing for everyone, because it doesn't model like that. So for example, if we tried to get a casual game player into Super Meat Boy, it probably wouldn't work. And you could say like, oh yeah, obviously, why would you try to do that? But yet we have things like Assassin's Creed 2, where they have a tutorial where you're given an achievement for literally following someone down a corridor, which is crazy if you think about it, because we're trying to make a game teach you how to control a character with a joystick, and that game is Assassin's Creed 2. Nobody who doesn't know how to control a character with a joystick is ever going to be able to play Assassin's Creed 2 or learn how to play it in the space that they're giving in this tutorial. That's like making a game about algebra and then making the first step in the tutorial is like, great, you know how to count. It's never going to happen. And what happens is, because we've been teaching people in this way for so long and we don't think about all of these other possible methods, we're kind of struggling against reality to cram enough steps into this tutorial when it actually no longer applies as a methodology. But like, fair enough, right? Because like, how would we do something as complicated as teaching people to be good problem solvers? We're just game makers. But yet, I think there are a number of games out there that do kind of appeal to everyone, right? Games that have really kind of taken the world by storm and introduced players to like totally complex skill sets who were totally not knowing how to do any of those things beforehand. So like Pac-Man introduced the entire world to hardcore arcade games, and Tetris introduced us to mobile gaming, and Minecraft introduced so many people to 3D spaces and exploring. And then my own game, which is not in this category, but is an easy thing for me to give you an example in, Spell Tower, introduced a lot of technophobic grandmas to computers and the joys of computer gaming. So like, how's that possible if it's not something we can teach? So it turns out that there is a way to enable non-expert problem solvers to solve problems that are out of their league. And it's this crazy, powerful technique that I was totally unaware of and have been sort of trying to do in my games. And I only discovered it because it turns out that my mom, in her PhD thesis, kind of like explored this like 20 years ago, and I had no idea. And then we had this weird phone conversation, and I was like, holy shit, this is there. And the trick is that it's all about the model formation, like coming up with the problem model. So the trick is, if you provide novice, and this is a secret, this is the one weird trick, if you provide novice problem solvers with a problem, they'll try to solve it with superficial strategies. They won't be able to do it the way that you want. But if you give them a context and you ask them to design their own problems, and you restrict the way that they design their own problems to make sure that they design good ones, they'll actually solve their own problems with expert level strategies. So it's kind of the difference between like teaching someone to fish and then putting someone at a pond and giving them a stick and a hook and a line and being like, just have fun, try to come up with something to do with these things. So like, personally, I think the reason that this works is because it's like disassociating the problem solving and the model formation and putting them into kind of separate camps. I think people kind of stress out when they're trying to form a model, but if you ask them to form the model first, which is essentially what you're doing by asking them to come up with a problem that fits these rules, they're internalizing the model during that step, and then when they actually get to the problem, they've already formed the problem model that represents the problem, so they're not going to get stuck on this superficial part. But that's a little bit abstract, right? So here's an example of how that actually works. So Spell Tower is a game that I made. If you're not familiar with it, it kind of combines word searches and Tetris. Once you spell out a word, the letters get removed, and then a new row of letters is added to the bottom, and if any letters reach the top row, you lose. So the main secret to, I think, why Spell Tower was so successful is that it actually has 2 tutorials in it. So the first one is sort of like actually an instruction manual, and it's called the tutorial, but it's not the real tutorial. It's the part of the game where it tells you all of the things that you need to think about when you're going to be forming problems. These are the rules of the game. They take less than a minute to get through. Whether you understand them all or not, it sort of doesn't matter. The second tutorial is a hidden tutorial, and it masquerades as a game mode called Tower Mode. So unlike the other 3 modes in Spell Tower, Tower Mode, which is this mode that you're looking at, has no explicit goals, no pressure, either time or systemic, no additional letters beyond what you start with, and no end condition at all. You actually have to hit the done button to be done. It ends when you say you're done. Most people say they're done when the letters run out. So what's fascinating about watching players play Tower Mode is that absent any particular problems to be solved or challenges to be tackled, they have to come up with their own problems. And often those problems are things like, can I spell a 6-letter word? Can I spell a word with a Q in it? What's the highest score I can get from a single word? What's the highest score I can get overall? Can I manage to clear out all the letters from the screen with none remaining? Or can I rearrange the letters through finding and eliminating words to spell a particular word? So these are two important, those questions, 2 things that they all share are, one, none of them are particularly better or worse than the others. None of them are particularly more fun or less fun. Some of them might be harder than other questions, but they all are sort of these enjoyable things to do within a system. And the second quality, which is really important, is that all of these questions teach you how to do things that will make you better at Spell Tower. They're all going to push you forward in your strategy of playing this game. They're not really idle exploration into weird corners of the system. Instead, they're sort of like a self-guided tour into the exact areas of the system that you need to become a better player. And just as a side note, it's sort of interesting to me how this is kind of the inverse of what we typically do with achievements. Because achievements generally don't reward exploration, and when they do, it's usually exploration into like fun and irrelevant corners of the system. So I'm really guilty of this with like BitPilot. Those 2 achievements are all about dying really fast in BitPilot. And BitPilot's a survival game. You don't want to die. While it's interesting to die really fast in BitPilot, learning how to die really fast won't actually make you better at BitPilot. So anyway, back to Spell Tower. So essentially what we have here is sort of this, like literally, it's a constraint-based system that asks players to find their own complex, non-routine problems and solve them. And the result is that players of all types can play this, learn how to become good problem solvers, and play Spell Tower, and play it as an expert level play. And I think this is pretty much what has made this game be so successful. It's sort of this quality of constrained sandboxes that are contained inside standard goal-oriented gameplay stuff. And we tend to see that quality over and over and over again in all of these successful games. So like Minecraft literally is a sort of sandbox the entire time with light things sort of pushing you in directions, or you can go to the creative mode where there's literally nothing. There's no, how can I manipulate this world? Others are less explicit sandboxes, but they still manage to support this kind of sandbox style exploration. So like Pac-Man supports this kind of play through obfuscating its goals, right? We know Pac-Man is a game where you try to beat all the levels and get to the end, but if you sat down and you'd never seen Pac-Man before, you wouldn't even know that there was a next level. You might not know what the goals are or what was happening. There's no instruction screen really in Pac-Man that's going to help you, except for like weird hints from the attract mode. And this provides an opportunity for players to create their own goals. And those goals look a lot like the kind of goals that you might see in Spell Tower. So things like collecting all the dots, or eating a giant blinking dot, or eating all the giant blinking dots, or eating all the ghosts after eating a giant blinking dot. That can be as much fun for somebody who's new at Pac-Man as actually trying to get a high score and beat the game. And the key with these goals, again, is that they're all in service of improving your Pac-Man skills. If you do any of the things that I just said, eventually you will teach yourself how to play Pac-Man, and you will be good at Pac-Man. Tetris does it too, but I'm over time, so I'm going to skip that. Also, so one important thing is I'm not trying to say that like all games should be taught in this way. Obviously, all games can't have these sandboxes. Super Meat Boy would not be a better game if it was taught this way. But it's important to kind of have this in our toolbox, because I think, you know, each of these games can seem like a straightforward video game, but if you look at them through this lens of like routine and non-routine and problem solving, you end up finding out like a lot of reasons why perhaps they are so accessible and why they're so popular. And I think, you know, this is kind of the dream, right? The best part about approaching players like this is that they don't just act like great problem solvers. The magic of this method is that they actually turn into great problem solvers. And great problem solvers are the best people to have playing your game. Like great problem solvers are the people who beat Ocarina of Time in 20 minutes, or start a league of Binding of Isaac racing, or play Spell Tower for 6 months and get 2 million points. Like this is the community that we want to have in all of our games. And it turns out that through building games as educational tools for themselves, we can kind of get a lot of people there. And so this is a little schlocky, but I kind of feel like games are just rules until they're played, right? We all kind of know that play is the act of game. And so it would follow that the beautiful games are the ones that are played the most beautifully. And I think there are ways that we can teach our players to do that with these kind of lenses. So thank you.
Thanks, Zach. That was awesome. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Drew Murray. Drew is the game director, is that the correct term? Game director of the recently released Sunset Overdrive, which you've probably all seen if not played. It's a really fun, I'm sure you'll see some of it now. And it's a very fun parkour-y skateboard shoot. I won't even attempt to describe it except to say it is fluorescently psychedelic in a way that seems like it would only come from someone who spent a lot of time working on the Resistance games and was not going to deal with Brown and Gray for one more second. It's also worked on Ratchet and Clank, Tools of Destruction, a really fun game and a really fun series, which I think is your inspiration for going to Insomniac. I'm really looking forward to hearing this sort of mechanical dive into how Sunset Overdrive came together. So without any further ado, Drew Murray.
Thank you. I have the heaviest laptop ever, but it turns out it's also the slowest. It's the same screen to confuse myself. All right, so you'll forgive me a little bit if this is off a little bit. I was having beers with my little brother on Friday night, and we were talking, and we were kind of talking about just, we just wrapped up Sunset Overdrive. It came out a little bit less than 3 weeks ago. Can everyone hear me? Okay. And he was laughing at some of the stories I was telling. He's like, oh, yeah, you should definitely talk about it. You should definitely talk about that. What are you going to talk about? And I told him and so I actually completely changed my talk in the last 2 days. So like I said, we released Sunset Overdrive 3 weeks ago, just under 3 weeks ago. I've spent thousands of hours playing this game, hundreds of hours playing it in its near final form. And in the last few weeks, I've been kind of going back and looking at what I think went well, what didn't go well. I've read now probably 150 reviews. I've read probably 4,000 or 5,000 forum posts about the game, and just sort of taking in a little bit more objective idea of what people think about the game. So 2 quick things before I get started. Most of my slides don't really have that much to do with what I'm talking about, a little bit. They're mostly a collection of my notes, design docs by myself and the team as we were working, images that I use for inspiration, and just some miscellaneous pictures. The other thing I just want to say is that this is really a talk from my perspective, and so sometimes I talk about sometimes that I was right and everyone else was wrong. But I want to make it clear that this really was a very much a team effort, and it's, even though I was right a few times and I got lucky and I probably focus on that more, the game would not have been the same without the team, and frankly, if it had just been me and Marcus Smith, the creative director, we would have created a giant turd. So. So this is the very first thing written down about what would become Sunset Overdrive. Marcus and I were having a conversation at lunch one day when we were working on Resistance 3 of what if you could make any game you wanted, what would you make? And the initial idea was sort of based on the turning the mechanics of the book I Am Legend into a game, where you have this post-apocalyptic society, and you've got this freedom to move around during the day and scavenge, but then at night it becomes very intense because all of a sudden the monsters come out, and so you have to really hunker down and defend. And it sounded really interesting to me mechanically to have that sort of those two things going on and going back and forth. As it turns out, it's probably not that good a great thing, because if someone doesn't like either one of those two things, you're kind of screwed. But about a year later, we pitched the game, and by that point, it had turned from this sort of Insomniac version of DayZ to something that was still mechanically the same, but it was a lot more colorful. It was very stylized. And about a year after that, we started working with a pre-production team of around 20 people, where it was, again, even more stylized. It was starting to get a little bit absurdist in the story, but it was still this scavenge by day, defend by night idea, which turned out not to be where we went. And then over the last 3 years, we pretty much dropped the scavenge and defend idea and ended up with a bright, colorful world that we call the Awesome Apocalypse. And it's it became a very fast, very action-paced game. And it's sort of a love letter to the games that Marcus and I and a lot of the team love, sort of more traditional arcade games, pinball, and other things like that. So when we actually started working on Sunset Overdrive, Marcus and I wanted to use a different process than we had in the past. We had a general direction we wanted to go. Games in the past had tended to come in with a very definitive idea, and this is exactly what we're going to do. And we wanted to do something a little bit different. And wow, I'm running really behind. So the first year, we basically didn't say no to any ideas. I'd read a great article by the Super Brothers called More Rock, Less Talk, which is about Jordan Mechner's ideas for developing games. And he was saying that first comes inspiration, and then people spend like this massive amount of time talking about what the game is going to be, and then they make it. And he was saying what you should do is come up with inspiration and then spend all this time making this stuff, and then after you have all this stuff, you kind of start talking about it at that point. And I think the inspiration is frankly one of the easier things to come up with. So I formulated it a little bit differently, which is after you've gotten the initial idea, it's more rock, less talk, which is the exploration of the idea. Then the leap of faith or intuition, when you have to kind of decide on what you're going to do a lot of times before you're really ready to. And then you go into what I call survival mode, which is you spend the next couple of years hoping that you made a good decision whenever you reach that point of no return and are trying to save yourself. So I don't really like talking about game features. So this idea of just making things and then talking about them, I think it was a great idea. I think you can kind of spin in circles talking about things, and it's easy to debate things when they're not real. But as soon as you have any actual thing, the conversation totally shifts. It's not, does this sound good? It becomes, how does this feel? How does this play? And it's about this thing rather than sort of this blue sky. What could maybe exist? And so during this period, Marcus and I, we wouldn't say no. People would tell us ideas, and we would evaluate them. We'd say, like, yeah, that sounds cool, or that's never going to make it. But as long as people were passionate about it, we'd give them a couple days and let them start working on things. And then we'd revisit it once they'd had a couple days to work on it. And sometimes we were right, but a lot of times we were very, very wrong. And parts of the game, as we went through this first year and even the first few months, big parts of the game started sort of collapsing or even getting sheared off. And sometimes they'd get replaced, and sometimes they would just disappear. But at some point, like I mentioned, I think that something that's not talked about or discussed a lot is this ability to have this sort of intuition or make that call at a point of no return. At Insomniac, we reached this point where we have 120 to 150 people working on this game, and just to finish the game, we have to make some big decisions. And at that point, we've got like all these ugly things that hopefully might become beautiful, and sort of trying to figure out which ones could become beautiful and which of all these different ones, if they became beautiful, would create this bigger beautiful thing that everyone's going to love. It's hard. It's hard to do that and trust in that and have that leap of faith, but it's something you have to do. And I don't really have any great answers here. Again, this is just the last few weeks I've been looking back at what worked for us and what didn't work for us, and trying to figure out specifically why I made good decisions. And I guess the last thing that I want to say before I move on to some specific examples is that it is hard to, especially when you're working with 120 or 140 people, every decision you make, a bunch of people hate it. And the best thing about having my partner Marcus Smith, the creative director, is he always tells me my ideas are good, and which he doesn't quite do that, but when I come to him, I've always been thinking through, and I'm like, I think this, and I've been thinking this through, and I can't tell if I'm right or wrong, and all these people are telling me wrong, but I thought about it, and I still think that, and what do you think? And he'll always be like, I think if you think it's a good idea, it's a good idea. And there are times that I'm the only person who thinks it's a good idea, and so it's always helpful to have someone who is sort of that moral support of, I understand where you're going with this, and have that high level view, and I think it's going to be okay, even though occasionally, as we'll talk about in a minute, it's not. This is my wall that I was like, if some teenage kid liked Sunset Overdrive, what their wall might look like, and it was behind my desk. I'm actually going to skip the part where I have a nervous breakdown because I'm running behind a little bit. If you want to talk about it, you can come ask me later. So the one of the first themes that we came up with was this idea of be who you want to be. And this was one of the first ideas that Marcus and I had. And one of our earliest decisions was that we wanted people to be able to express themselves through our character customization. And there's the manifestation of something. I was reading Turning Pro by Stephen Pressfield. It's his sequel to The War of Art, which is a great book about the creative struggle. And I'm going to read a little excerpt here that kind of focused me on this, and it's the little title of this short chapter is called "The Tribe Doesn't Give a Shit." The amateur dreads becoming who she really is because she fears that this new person will be judged by others as different. The tribe will declare us as weird or queer or crazy. The tribe will reject us. Here's the truth. The tribe doesn't give a shit. There is no tribe. That gang or posse that we imagine is sustaining us by the bonds we share is in fact a conglomeration of individuals who are just as fucked up as we are and just as terrified. Each individual is so caught up in his own bullshit that he doesn't have 2 seconds to worry about yours or mine, or to reject or diminish us because of it. When we truly understand that the tribe doesn't give a damn, we're free. There is no tribe, and there never was. Our lives are entirely up to us. And that's a little bit easier said than done. I think he simplifies it a little bit, but when he's trying to inspire you to follow your heart and art, it sounds really good. But I wanted to get a sense of that into Sunset Overdrive. And I'm not really big on things like karma systems. I think making this sort of meaningful life or moral choices in games tends to be role playing in a way that feels very separated, or a lot of times becomes like, well, I want to try out the evil powers, and so I'm gonna be bad, so I can check those out. But I had been obsessively watching the Bill Cunningham documentary about the New York Times street fashion photographer, and I started thinking about how strictly society judges our appearance. And I was thinking about, well, the barrier to getting like an average guy to like get in a fight or like cheat somebody or even like start a war actually seems like a lot lower than getting a guy to like put on a skirt and go out in public. And so I started thinking that maybe through this customization we could sort of express this idea of exploring an alternate self. And in the movie, Bill Cunningham says, the wider world perceives fashion sometimes as a frivolity that should be done away with in the face of social upheavals and problems that are enormous. The point is, in fact, that it's the armor to survive the reality of everyday life. And so we said, we're going to give the people the ability to try all this crazy stuff and wear all these things that they wouldn't normally wear, and allow and hopefully encourage them to let their inner freak flag fly. And when I say freak, I don't mean like freak in a bad sense. I mean in like a 60s sort of like be who you want to be sense. We're going to have different body sizes, different genders, different races. We're not going to designate different clothings or hairstyles or makeup as male or female. Everything is wearable by anyone. The last decision that we made in the game was actually when the lead character artist came to me and was like, well, we can either make 20 beards for men, or we can make 10 beards that work on both the male and female bodies. And I was like, how can you even be asking me that question at this point? We're all in. And the most controversial decision about it was actually that Marcus and I said we were absolutely not going to have any stats associated with clothing. And this just drove the design team insane. There were, I honestly, I can't tell you how many meetings there were in that there were anywhere from like 3 to 12 designers in the room. And at first they would argue and debate. And then as the months went on, they started begging and pleading. We have to have this from a mechanical standpoint. You know, people aren't going to be interested in the idea of just dressing up. And I totally get the mechanical side of that statement. But I think it was for Marcus and I, it was very much of a thematic thing that was more important than the mechanics. And I felt like we could find a different way to get those mechanics in. And I think that they had a point. And frankly, I was really terrified by this at the end, because it was so hard to see how this system was going to be compelling. Even at the end, when I was playing the game through over and over again, I was trying to play it so fast to look at the more mechanical things that, frankly, I didn't spend a lot of time messing with this. By the way, that's my daughter, and a couple of years ago, and that's there's an Easter egg where you can unlock her outfit in the game. And then this is the character that she made for herself in the game. This is the first time she ever actually held a joystick, which was exciting. Yeah, right. I brought home a dev kit so I could turn off all the monsters, and so she just ran. All she wanted to do was go swimming. So, and so we didn't want people feeling like they had to wear, you know, like the Robin Hood hat to have +2 agility, or I don't know what the panda bear eyes with flaming eyes gives you, but. We had this big struggle, and fortunately for us, you know, when we really started showing the game off at E3, it was right at the time when diversity was really coming up. Assassin's Creed, you know, came out and said that they weren't going to have women in the game, and we actually like a week later did a little version of our Sunset TV where we had our character and we made like an Assassin's Creed outfit for our characters. And they're very different games, and our animations don't look nearly as good as theirs, but yeah, again, it was really hard to evaluate how this was going to be. But if you hop online now, there are a ton of people complaining that the Xbox doesn't have a screenshot tool, and are using capture cards and taking screenshots off of video clips, and all these arguments that we had with Microsoft in particular, when they were like, well, what if people want to dress like they're from they just went shopping at J. Crew, and we were like we got into these very like specific fights of like, all right, this is going to be like the J. Crew and Banana Republic percentage, and this is going to be like the kind of edgy percentage, and this is going to be the really weird percentage, and they were very nervous up until I think the very end about that. But the nicest thing, this is off mostly off of NeoGAF, different outfits that people are wearing and have made for themselves. But the nicest thing, one of the things that I hoped would happen was a post on NeoGAF, and it said, it was by a woman. It said, "I wanted to play as a guy, as I usually love to." Oh shit. I wanted to play as a guy, as I usually love to dress them more than women. But since I'm a girl and the body proportions are true to mine, I definitely was making a girl. Plus, I have my afro that I actually have. It felt like an enlightening experience. Insomniac so far is the only developers who have blessed me with my actual hairstyle. I cried, lol. So super sweet. I'm gonna get my plug so I don't actually run out of batteries here. And fortunately, it did work out okay. I've got one little last video that I will show before I wrap up. And this is just a little video from where we ended up with the game. And it didn't get this way for a long time, but there's obviously that 2-year period between the last thing I showed and here. And it really was a daily process. There was never a day that somebody wasn't working on the traversal system, either the designer or the world designers or the programmers or animators. And it did not become apparent that it was fun or good until maybe 6 months ago, like really good. And even then there's still a lot of polish, but I don't know, I found it really interesting looking back on the fact that we do have to, particularly with games of this size, have to make calls and decisions really early on before we really are sure that things are fun, just because we have all these people and at some point they're done with their last project and this giant tidal wave of people comes over to our project, and we have to be like, okay, well this is what we're working on, and this is what we're going to do. So again, I don't really have any big conclusions from that, other than then I don't know. I'll figure it out next time I see you guys. You can ask me what I actually figured out from this. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach and Drew. Yeah, now we'll have discussion. I guess I will try. No, I will not. Clara. Oh, okay.
Hello. These were really cool talks. My questions for Zach. Actually, your talk was a perfect segue to the feedback loop, kind of mysteriously. It was really interesting. Learning about, why do we make tutorials that are about experimentation and sandbox? There are some people making educational games. I know that the Education Arcade in MIT has a design principle where they want to make games where players can fail safely. And the idea of experimenting because it's a way of gaining that expertise. But one of the issues with designing problems and challenges and puzzles is that they have to be identifiable. And I don't know if any of what you've done or in the literature, I don't know that literature that well. I mean, I can think of things like the Norman and usability, like being able to identify what the problem is. Because at times you can, say you are in a room and you're experimenting with the physics, but the problem might be that you have to get out of the room. And you don't know that there might be a door that is openable, and you just think that they're all decorations. So it's like, how do we let players learn what the problem is? Like, first is because in a way, when you were putting all these word problems, my issue with word problems is that I understood the problem, but I couldn't they were written like crap, right? So it's like, what is the problem first?
So
it's like a first step, right?
So that's like the trick. Like, that's why this is hard and that we don't see it a lot. Is this even on? Yes? No? Okay, cool. Like, that's why we don't see it a lot, because you sort of have to design your entire game holistically to be this teaching vehicle. So the way that it's actually done in the research is that, like, an example would be you give people a bunch of parking signs that have information about parking, and then you say, design a 2-step problem, a problem that uses like 2 different mathematical operations, and then solve it. And that will like enforce that whoever's playing the game, or whoever's coming up with the problem, will come up with a complicated problem that's non-routine, because they have to come up with one that's weird. And effectively, you have to do the same thing in video games. So you're basically designing a system that gives you as a player constraints as to what the problem that you need to be is. And this is like what is so elegant at Pac-Man. Like, all of the things in Pac-Man end up constraining and implying to the player what kind of problems would be fun for them and what they want to attempt. And then ultimately the problems that the player comes up with happen to be like within range of problems that will teach them how to play the game. There's no trick to that, because it's like going to be unique to whatever circumstance it is. But I do think like one thing that's worth looking at is like, okay, when you play test your game, and you have a part that's a little open, what do people try to do? And then if they're trying to do something that's not really going towards your vision of what's interesting and what they're doing isn't interesting, then you have to go, okay, well, why are they doing that? What are the things that are encouraging them to do this? Is there a way that I could encourage them to do something else? Am I valorizing a type of behavior through points? Am I providing too much? Are points too big and too important? Is the way that the game sessions are running encouraging people to want to be careful when they're not? Am I being too aggressive with enforcing like that this is a challenge? I mean, I think what's interesting about like what you're talking about with like getting people to like do the right problem and like being able to fail safely is actually, I think, looking at a problem too late. Because if you're looking at the problem of like, we need people to fail safely, what you're doing is you're looking at a point where that person is already trying to solve a problem and they're getting it wrong. And that's actually well past the point where you can teach someone to be a good problem solver, because they may be applying a superficial approach that they're never going to get right. And making them comfortable being wrong is not actually going to help them make a better problem model in their head, because it's way too late for that. You've already passed that point. So what you really want is like, to look at it in sort of a more holistic earlier way, where you're saying, okay, first we need to get people to build the problem model. And if you can build a problem model, then you will on your own already fail safely because you're comfortable in the space that you're exploring. And that's kind of what the idea is.
I guess I'll follow up on that, asking Drew. I mean, so you're dealing with a big AAA game with a incredibly colorful backgrounds, intentionally sensory overload, where you also have to teach the player what matters, what doesn't. You have a very particular play style of like, constant action, the floor is lava, like keep going, streak up. And in Sunset Overdrive, there is some tutorializing, which is very self-consciously ironic, self-deprecating, kind of like, we're sorry, we kind of have to, what were the challenges for it? You wanted people to be able to be self-expressive, and it sounds like what Zach's talking about was probably sort of intuitively in your mind in some way of like, we don't want to lead people from point A to point B explicitly in this way. We want them to feel empowered. Like, how did you deal with that?
Yeah, I think we have a brief period where it is very point A to B, and I think the controls for a console game are actually pretty complicated. And I think this is probably one of the things we didn't do very well. Reading the forums, it seemed like it took a lot of people. There was the aha moment somewhere in the 2 to 3 hour range, which is a really long time for a AAA console game. I think people got through it, but at some point around the 2 to 3 hour, people will be like, oh, wow. And then you unlock a specific move around 4 hours or so, depending on how quickly you're going through. And it's like, oh, now I get it. And it's tough because there was so much information, and we were doing, I think ultimately we were also probably trying to do too many things in the game sometimes. I think if we had stuck with sort of just the combat and traversal, it would have been easier. And we had the thing that I didn't talk about that I think was sort of a failure on my part was we had this night defense section, which was this little tower defense section that it was the first thing we worked on. It was the first thing that became fun. And I think because of that, I held on to it a little bit too long and a little bit too strictly. And so we had some things like that I think sort of slowed the process down of people getting in and finding what the most fun part is, which is honestly just moving through the world.
Actually, yeah, all right. Yeah. One thing I would just want to latch onto, which I thought was really interesting in your talk, was that small moment where you sort of said like you wanted your daughter to be able to play it, so you brought home the dev kit and you got rid of all the monsters. Like, that's a real legitimate experience for someone to want to have. And for somebody who's never going to be able to go from that experience, like at that level, you're never going to be able to play the game the way everybody else is. But like, why aren't there big AAA games that you can just walk around and experience the world in when that's something that people are going to want to do? And I think ultimately, like, that's kind of what Minecraft is. That's like the thing that sort of, I think, open 3D worlds up to so many people is like, finally, here's a game where I can just walk around and experience this beautiful world that everybody else is experiencing with these like tremendous draconian challenges that like I'm not ready to do, and now I can just do that. And I think sometimes like the seriousness that we kind of present these like games with is like hamstringing our ability to let people into them, because there's really no reason why you couldn't have a mode where people just walk around without monsters, except that it like kind of doesn't make sense from like all of the perspectives.
And we don't.
Right.
But if there's a sequel, which hopefully there will be, I would. It's like one of the things on my high list. Is like, yeah, why don't we have a place? And there people actually complain after they've beaten the game. They're like, can everyone hear me? Sorry. All right. I'll talk loud. Okay, for the video. Yeah, some people actually complain. They're like, I'm trying to just even stop and like look at the world and just notice some of the details and things. And people are like, but these monsters keep coming and they're messing with me doing that. So yeah, I would actually like to have just a free roam. You can sandbox space. It'd be fun.
Cool. Yeah. Should I hand the mic around? Oh, we do.
And while that's happening, I think that you got that comment is a testament to the expression that you built into the system that you allowed.
Yeah. Oh, all right.
So as a lapsed cognitive psychologist, you're talking me a kind of warm, fuzzy feeling inside.
Cool.
So
I
the
wasn't
question,
totally off.
well, so the question that I have is, at least if I took your point, which was using sort of undirected exploratory learning as part of tutorial process, the problem with that, or the potential problem with that, is people might have essentially a wrong model in their head of what actually is going on. Unless the system is just really simple, even with simple systems, people tend to, if you leave them alone, will develop a misinformation about how things work. And if they actually then face later on, essentially, the model that I have in my head is wrong, I think you might have sort of disappointment, or you might have essentially conflict with players and so on.
Well,
right, so that's the purpose of having a very directed, step-by-step type learning system.
Well, what I would actually say is I think the model that everybody has when they learn any game is always wrong. The first thing you come up with is always wrong. Like when I play board games, the first thing I do is I try to find the weird little exploit. And like that's ultimately wrong when somebody figures out how to counter that. So I think like having a model that's wrong is within the natural process of learning. The trick is giving people the tools and the space to feel comfortable analyzing their model and be able to compare it to other models, so that the more information they get, the more they can start to make informed choices about like finding better and more accurate models.
Yeah, it's actually a sort of a follow-up question, I guess. I'm wondering whether you see anything interesting in Zach in trying to follow in the games like Castle Doctrine or Volume, where the key game mechanic is creating problems for other players. And if you're a beginning player, you can do that very simply, or you could do it in a...
I mean, I don't know very much about Volume, but I know a little bit about Castle Doctrine. And I mean, I think that this is sort of, I think those games are within a genre that we've sort of seen, which is like, let's build a problem and sort of send it out to the world. I think Castle Doctrine is very aggressive, and I think that would probably have trouble in this space. But I mean, I certainly think those kinds of games are interesting. I think the trick is that there's really a difference between creating a problem for somebody else as a challenge to you and creating a problem for yourself that you will solve for yourself, and the rewards will be all internal. And I think that's the type of thing that well, and also research would say that's the type of thing that like allows for this kind of learning, is like the problems where you kind of have your stress and your model building as separate things. And also I think like a really good example of this, like I think The Sims totally kills in this respect, and like it's no surprise that The Sims is unbelievably popular, because who plays The Sims one way? Everybody plays The Sims their own way, and that's awesome. That's the game, and like all these people are getting into games and numbers and like all these crazy systems that they might have been scared of, except that here's this game that allows them to express themselves and explore things and learn stuff and get better. And
Hey, so I'm really interested in this kind of sandbox experience as perhaps part of the design process itself. And if you are using that, let's say to achieve this kind of holistic thing of like, well, I'm not sure what the problems are that I want to even imagine for players. How are you deciding what limitations to maybe put on, what you're going to even give people as far as those freedoms are concerned?
I'm sorry.
Well, I guess sort of what I'm trying to get at is like, in both cases, there seemed to be a link with a moment where you realized inside or outside of teaching a player how to do something, but also in like figuring out what a game is about, there's this potential for a kind of holistic methodology to a design practice.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, in each case where it's possible to say beyond, oh, this is fun or not fun, what those limitations should be if you're asking your players to create problems for themselves.
I think that there is something holistic, and I think that like obviously we are looking for things that are fun, and we create a lot of things that were fun, but ended up not really fitting correctly. I think the thing that fortunately by the time we did start, we had a pretty clear picture on was we had a certain tone that we wanted to keep, and that was something that we kept evaluating things against. I think that shifted somewhat. There were things like Insomniac is known for our crazy weapons, and I was like, we're not going to have crazy weapons in this game because I want people to talk about anything other than the crazy weapons, because that's what everyone talks about every time we make a game. And yet we ended up with crazy weapons because this guy came in at the time we were talking about the rock and roll end times, and that was more like an attitude than like. But we had people coming like, so when is there going to be like the rhythm game where you're playing guitar to like defeat monsters? And a guy came up and he wanted to make a gun that shoots 12-inch vinyl LPs, and I was like, this is the worst combination ever, because not only is it like this literal rock and roll thing, it's also crazy weapons, and it's never going to work, but we can give you a couple days to do it. And he came back and we were like, God damn it. Okay, yeah, we'll have crazy weapons, and it totally fits and it totally works. So I think just having that, having an idea of the tone, but then being flexible against it, I think that was ultimately what we matched up against. As far as methodology, I wish I had more of one. This was a very different experience than we've done in the past, just that this year of letting people kind of do largely what they wanted to do. I think it turned out really well. I think part of the reason it turned out well, I think if we made any good decision from a director side, it was that nothing has to make sense, and we're breaking the fourth wall and all that kind of thing. And so anyone who had any crazy idea, we were like, if you've been holding back some crazy idea for 10 years, now is the idea to throw this out. And if it's fun and it fits the tone, it doesn't have to make sense. We will just squirm it in there in one way or the other. And I think that ultimately that gave the freedom to these 120, 150 people who are working on it. And I think you ended up with a lot of people's passion that's crammed into this game. That's very different when if you're like, yeah, we're making a super realistic military shooter, and so anything that deviates from this very narrow corridor doesn't fit.
I love the contrast going on here. This is so good. So for me it's completely different. So I make small games that are like simple systems, and my goal is always like I'm trying to find systems out there where I stumble into it and there's something about it that's like fascinating. And I think like for me, one of the key sort of skills in this is trying to be able to identify like when you've found something that's like actually really fascinating, something that like leads into a lot of other things and is like a really neat just kind of gem of a systemic moment. And then once I have that and I have this thing that I'm excited about, then it turns into like building a game around it where my goal is to get somebody else to be standing in the same place that I'm standing, looking at the same thing that I'm looking at and going, wow, that is really exciting and interesting. And that's a really hard, complicated thing to do. And so for me, that's the only goal. It's like, how do I get people to find the thing that's interesting that I find interesting? And sometimes in building the way to get there, someone finds something else that's interesting that isn't what I thought of, and then it's like, oh wow, that's great, I'm glad this supports that. Can I buffer that in some way so that it supports it better, or is it just naturally something that works? But that ends up being sort of my play testing strategy that like allows this to happen. Is like I give people the game, I see where they get to, I think about like what are the things I could do to help them find their way to the thing that's interesting, or if they're already getting there, like great.
Thank you. So I really love the character designs and customization in Sunset Overdrive.
Thanks.
And I just think it's like awesome and really really queer and fantastic, and I would play that. I was wondering why binary gender the bodies. It's like, why not kind of go all the way and kind of make it more of like a Saints Row-esque slider kind of thing?
It's a good question. It's actually I'm actually emailing with someone who emailed us about it, and we actually don't specifically say that it's male or female, and we've got like four body types lined up. We decided not to use sliders throughout the game just because each piece of clothing actually has to be built 4 times to work on the four bodies, and so sort of just from a technology point, we were limited a little bit, but then also we wanted to curate things a little bit more so that we wanted to curate things more so that with the sliders, we actually didn't want people having like too much control over things like faces and things like that. And I think we could definitely do better. Like I really regret not having like a skin tone selection. Instead, we've got like particular faces that go with particular skin tones. Voices. It's actually the voice that I think is the most sort of gender binary thing, because we have a male actor and a female actor, and there's for better or worse, we don't have good programmatic lip syncing, and so everything in the world is hand animated. So we actually have these 2 vocal tracks, and all the lips are animated twice to match up to those 2 things. I would love to get a lot more voice selection, and I'm trying to convince our core team that it's worth doing good lip syncing. So I can't promise you exactly what we're going to do if we do a sequel, but I definitely would like to head in that direction. If you actually have particular thoughts, I'd be happy to hear them on sort of how to create something that is more in the middle or less identified.
Can you explain exactly how the architecture of the city needed to change and why for the traversal idea that you had?
Yeah, so basically everything in the world is traversable. So like telephone wires and handrails and awnings are bouncy, cars are bouncy, and so we originally just built the city, and it was buildings that you would move into, but basically everything had to become interactive. And all these metrics of, okay, now we are going with this, and so when you're grinding, when you jump off there, we want to have at least 2 or 3 possibilities of where you can go to next. And so really the entire city was built around more of this sort of mechanical, everything connects to something else. And we had the aesthetics sort of going in the right direction at that point, but to make it work with the traversal system, it was really we built a small area, and we're like, okay, this is kind of what we're going for. Now we had to start over, but maybe we built like an eighth of the city at that point. It wasn't like we completely ripped the game apart.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Yeah, in the back. Yeah.
Hi, this is a question more for Drew. Sorry, Zach. I was pretty intrigued to hear about how so many of the traversal type mechanics and stuff like that seem to be generated by the dev team in what you described as game jams. And I've heard about how these sort of game jams work in other AAA companies and experienced a little bit myself, but I was wondering if you could speak more to the process of that within the company. Is it you give a few days for everyone at the company to kind of work on whatever they want? Was it more open, like you were kind of hinting at, for longer stretches of time? And besides traversal, or maybe what specific aspects of traversal came out of a game jam example and then did you use that sort of game jam footage to convince the publisher that was worth going forward with, or was that more of an internal decision? Just the whole game jam process, I'm a little bit curious about.
Sure. We didn't do as many as I wish we had. We mostly did them in pre-production, and when we would do them, we would have like 2 or 3 days set aside for people to work on whatever they wanted to. At the same time, the first year, a lot of it was kind of self-directed. We would hit points and say, okay, well, these are some things we need to get done to move the game forward, and different people were responsible for those things. But at the same time, if Cameron Christian, the guy who really was the genesis of the traversal system, it was just something he was passionate about, and he first did the telephone wires that you could grind on, and we were like, but you'll give you a few more days, and it honestly it was several months of, all right, we'll give you a couple more days. We'll give you a couple more days. We'll give you a couple more days, and then it turned into basically 3 years of a couple more days. I'm trying to think of what else came out of game jams. Nothing else giant jumps out. Actually, you know what? I take that back. The first city we built, we actually rebuilt it several times. But the first city we built actually looked a lot like Burbank. And I don't know if you've ever been to Burbank, but it's really boring. It's not anywhere you would like want to spend time in a fantasy world. And there's no fantasy fulfillment there. And during our first game jam, one of the designers built a city, and he was inspired partially by Elder Scrolls or Skyrim. He was like, there's always all these fantastic points off in the distance that I want to be going to, and I'm in our world, and I don't ever feel that way. Like I feel like I'm walking around right outside of our offices, and so he built this crazy, weird space that didn't really make any sense and had waterfalls, and it looked sort of like something between like something out of like Star Wars Episode 1 and the anime Tech on Concrete, and we were like, yeah, like why, artists, why aren't you making the world look like that? And it really, I mean, it was a hard right turn of really this very, very dull city to much more fantastic architecture and that kind of thing. So that was another big win for us.